Hi, thank you all so much for coming this evening. I'm Istara, and I have a dream that one day there'll be enough care to go around. My grandmother, or my Nani, as I call her, is a huge part of my life, and she was one of the most important people in my childhood, as I saw her once or twice every single week. And because of that, her little blue car became a staple of my childhood. And my brother and I were always so excited when she came in her car to pick us up, because she never forgot to bring snacks. Bear rolls, dried mango, fruit, smoothies, juices, the list goes on. And one of the things I really loved about my Nani was that she always remembered everything I told her. She'd remember my millions of hobbies, or the projects I'd been doing at school, my friends, my enemies. And she'd always ask me questions when I was going home about what I'd been doing that day. But about 2 years ago, things started to change. She started repeating questions or misplacing objects, and then she began forgetting entire conversations or what she'd been doing earlier that day. Earlier this year, she stopped being able to pick me up, not for lack of want, but because she had to stop driving. She stopped driving, not just for her safety, but for the safety of everyone around her as well. That's because it had become clear at that point that my Nani had a form of dementia. In May, she was officially diagnosed as having Alzheimer's, which, as described by the NHS, is a progressive and incurable disease that's the most common cause of dementia. It was devastating, but not entirely unexpected. The signs had been there. Dementia can take many different forms for different people, but for my Nani, it crept up on us quickly. Her symptoms would worsen from month to month, and she became more dependent as she got more confused. But the hardest part for me, as a daughter and as a granddaughter, was watching those who cared for her most. My mum, my aunt, and my grandfather struggled to adapt and care for her as they themselves were still grieving. And I was watching the emotional strain that they were under and the struggle to find help that they faced that made me want to do this talk. Because although the awareness about dementia has grown so much in recent years, I believe that we're still not talking about the millions of people in the UK and around the world who are constantly working to support their loved ones. The NHS estimates that there are around 944,000 people in the UK who are living with dementia. And that number skyrockets to 1 in 11 when we look at over 65s. Now, if we do some maths and assume that every person with dementia are lucky enough to be like my Nani and have 3 people who can care for them, be that family, friends, or neighbours, then we get an estimate of around 2,800,000, my mental maths isn't that good, 832,000 people who are currently working as caregivers in the UK. But dementia is only one disease, and there are an untold number of other diseases and that affect thousands of people in the UK, leaving them in desperate need of unpaid caregivers to maintain their quality of life. And we know that there is such an immense need for unpaid caregivers because of the census. In 2021, the England and Wales census found that roughly 5 million people were currently providing unpaid care. For reference, that's around 8.8% of the population. That is a massive number of people that we barely ever hear about in the mainstream media. And whilst it's important to note that many of these people don't take on this role begrudgingly, a Carers UK report found that 62%, almost 2/3 of people, had no other choice in taking up this role. That's because caring is so complex that it's often extremely difficult, and more often not expensive, to find a caregiver, a paid caregiver, who can provide help to your loved ones. But why am I talking about this now? Why do I care now? Well, that's because in the UK, we have an aging population. Currently, the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, estimates that there are roughly 12.7 million people in the UK over the age of 65. But in 50 years' time, the ONS estimate that there will be 22.1 million people over the age of 65. That's around a 10 million person increase. And with the proportion of people over the age of 65 increasing, the number of people with age-related diseases, like dementia, will undoubtedly rise as well, increasing the need for unpaid caregivers. Now, I just want you to look at the person on your left and your right. Say hi, make friends. Okay, great. Well, statistically, both of the people who you've just looked at will at one point in their life be an unpaid caregiver. And that is such a massive number of people that we barely ever talk about. So why don't we talk about them more? Well, I believe part of the reason why it's hard to talk about caregiving is because it's such a broad umbrella term. It can encompass anything from going to the shops for someone and having a cup of tea, to lifting them into the bath or helping them go to the toilet, and at the worst of times, having to weather anger, aggression, or even violence from the person you're looking after. And also, I think care is such a gentle and vague word that it's also hard for people to associate it with the grueling emotional and physical consequences that it can have. And unfortunately, there certainly is a massive mental and physical toll that it takes on caregivers. Should look at some statistics now. Okay, so caregiving is a massive role, and it's constant. And it can take up so much of a person's day-to-day life. And for something that will take up so much of a person's daily life, it's no wonder that it would have an effect on their mental health. What is shocking is how overwhelmingly negative that effect is. A Carers UK report found that 62% of all current and former caregivers reported a slightly or very negative impact on their mental health. That's unacceptable. Perhaps part of the reason why many of these caregivers might face a negative impact on their mental health might be because of the isolation that comes with caregiving. As I previously mentioned, it is a massive 24/7 role that many people take on. And it might be hard for many of these carers to focus on relationships other than with the person they're caring for. Now that means that they might lose relationships, key relationships that serve as part of a support system, allowing their mental health to plummet. 37% of all current and former caregivers reported a negative impact on their relationships. And I wish I could tell you that the negative statistics stop here, but unfortunately they don't. Caregiving can also have an effect on your physical health, like I've mentioned. And that might be because of the manual labor, like lifting someone into the bath or helping them to the toilet, that caring can take. 53% of all current and former caregivers reported a negative impact on their physical health. And that can lead into a doom cycle where these caregivers are then at their own health risks that might lead to them needing an unpaid caregiver in the future. You see how it's a terrible cycle? More than that, 48% of all current and former caregivers reported a negative impact on their job and ability to work. That means that caregiving can have an overall effect on your career and ultimately your finances. Now, I just want you to look back to the person on your left and your right. Would you ever want the negative impact on their career, the negative impact on their relationships, the negative impact on their physical health, and the negative impact on their mental health that they are currently statistically going to face if and when they become a caregiver? I mean, I'm going to assume that's a no. And I also think that it's important to remind you of the statistic I said earlier, that 62%, almost 2/3 of caregivers, had no choice in becoming a caregiver. Meaning there's no opt-out, there's no easy way to avoid these statistics. So how can we help? How can we help care for the people who do so much for us? Well, it's hard to say one be-all and end-all solution, because the type of care can vary so dramatically. But you can't go wrong with saying do the little things for people, like have a regular conversation with them about anything. Just remind them that they are so much more than the person they cared for. And on a broader level, I think there needs to be more education and overall systemic change so that we can support these unpaid caregivers more. And finally, we're also living in such an amazing time of such massive advancements in science and technology, like the growth of AI, that I have no doubt that AI will be able to help caregivers in the future, such as preventative AI, which can go through vast medical data sets and predict health issues years before they might be diagnosed with doctors, meaning that preventative care can be taken of them and might alleviate the overall need for unpaid caregivers in their future. But that's the future, and we need change now. Because even though we might not be able to stop the spread of Alzheimer's in my Nani's brain, it is far from being too late to help those who support her. So if you take one thing away from this speech, is that we need to care for our carers like they care for us. So thank you so much for listening and coming this evening and listening to my dream that one day there'll be enough care to go around.